Hello students, Mr. Young here. Welcome to Chapter 15, Lesson 2. Today we're talking about the abolition movement. So I've been drawing references to the abolition movement for a few chapters now, and we're finally here, a whole lesson on abolition. So abolitionists are those that sought to end slavery in the United States. And there's actually more to it than you think. For example, there were different factions of abolitionists in different times, and they said, do we want to end slavery gradually over time or ban it outright? And these were all things that they had to talk about. We also get to talk about Frederick Douglass, who I really like. He has a really good book. Very easy to read, very enjoyable read. It's called The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass by Frederick Douglass. It's like really an adventure, except it really happened. Check it out sometime. You might actually have to read it in school fairly soon. So, even before the formation of the United States, there were those who were opposed to slavery. The earliest abolitionists wanted to end slavery gradually. They thought it could be slowly phased out. And in the North, that's essentially what happened. It was slowly kind of phased out by the early 1800s. When the U.S. government was being formed, like they're writing the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation and all those things, slavery was a social issue that kept coming up. When the country was originally formed, they ended up settling on a compromise saying that the federal government will not outlaw or allow slavery. They'll leave it up to the individual states, and that's what happened. After the invention of the cotton gin, as we learned about, and the growth of cotton as a cash crop, the southern demand for slavery came to rise a lot. They need a lot more slaves, and this all happened in a time of reform that we were talking about in the last lesson, and it kind of created this perfect storm of tension between abolitionists and slaveholders in the North and South in general. Of note, some of the very earliest abolitionists, even from the very beginning of the country, were actually the Quakers. We remember learning about William Penn, and he was a Quaker at the Society of Friends, and they were sort of a weird minority religion population. Weird is harsh. They're strange. Weren't always the most popular, but they were among the first supporters of the immediate freeing of all slaves. So there was this plan that they had. They called it the colonization plan. There were a number of barriers to ending slavery. Even supporters of abolition were unsure of the effects of freeing a significant slave population just into the country. A number of influential and wealthy Americans came up with a plan. They formed the American Colonization Society. The idea was to send free slaves back to Africa to what would become the country of Liberia. They basically purchased land over in Africa for free slaves, where the free African Americans would move and basically restart their lives in their native homeland. The colony idea really didn't pan out, however. They only ended up moving about 10,000 free African Americans. The problem was many of the free African Americans really had no ties to Africa anymore. They were born in the United States, and the United States was their home. Alright, the rest of the lesson, for the most part, is just a whole bunch of different abolitionists. Here's where we're going to get into it. There are a number of notable abolitionists. Some were white and some were black, and we'll get to that now. In the 1830s, the idea of gradually ending slavery and colonization basically gave way to people wanting to end slavery right now. Immediate ban. William Lloyd Garrison was actually the first abolitionist to call for the immediate end of slavery. He had an abolition newspaper called The Liberator, which he first published in 1831. Garrison commanded a great deal of influence in the abolition movement and formed multiple abolition societies, like the American Anti-Slavery Society, that had thousands of local chapters throughout the country. There was a pair of sisters that became prominent in the abolition movement. The Grimke sisters were the daughter of a wealthy South Carolina plantation owner. They moved to Philadelphia, where they spoke out against slavery. Both sisters, Sarah and Angelina, asked for their inheritance early and asked that the payment be received in slaves. And so when they got their slaves that were their inheritance, they immediately set them free. The sisters, along with their husband, or Angelina's husband, they didn't share a husband. So Angelina, Sarah and Angelina's husband, wrote American Slavery as It Is. In 1839, it was one of the most powerful pieces of abolition literature of that era. No tale of abolition is complete without mentioning Harriet Beecher Stowe and her book Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was essentially a fictional tale of a slave in the South. Its purpose was to shed light on slavery, which it did, as it sold many, many copies, particularly in the North, because the book was said to be propaganda in the South, and it was banned. They didn't like it. It made slavery look really, really bad. And you say, how can you make slavery look really, really bad? Slavery is really, really bad. The fictional account, it's an interesting read. You basically read it, you go, oh my God, this poor guy. And a lot of people didn't really know what was going on in the plantations. So it brought that life to light. Let's see, Frederick Douglass. I love Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is the best known African American abolitionist. He was born into slavery in Maryland and escaped into the North as a young man. Now, Douglass was a gifted orator, and used his skills to speak in public, even though that made it more likely for him to get caught. A little later in life, he created a abolition newspaper called North Star, and he was actually able to buy his freedom from his former master. You say, why would he do that if he escaped? That was basically so he could be real free and not an escaped slave, and not have to worry about being caught or taken back. I almost skipped this paragraph. Free and escaped African Americans played a prominent role, like Frederick Douglass, in the abolition movement, as you may well imagine. The first African American newspaper was called Freedom's Journal. It was created in 1827 by Samuel Cornish and John Russwurm. David Walker published a powerful abolition pamphlet in New England. There was a meeting in Philadelphia in 1830. All the leaders of the free African American community came together to talk about things, basically how to make their conditions better. They talked about making a college and the best movement for abolition and things like that. So there was organized efforts, not only by whites but by blacks, to work on bettering the condition of life for all African Americans, be they free or slaves. And we talked about Frederick Douglass. We're going to hit Sojourner Truth now. Her original name was Isabella Malmfree, and she was born a slave in New York, so in the North. She suffered a harsh childhood but was able to escape from her master, and she was finally free when New York ended slavery officially in 1827. Once free, she changed her name to Sojourner Truth, which makes sense because she traveled around and told people about her childhood as a slave, and so really she was a prominent voice in the abolition movement. There she is. Alright, the Underground Railroad. Abolitionists created a network of houses on routes from south to north, and escaped slaves would travel at night and then hide in the attics, barns, and basements of these Underground Railroad stations during the day. Conductors would serve as guides to the escaped slaves. Working on the Underground Railroad was dangerous because it was against the law, technically, and there were pretty harsh punishments for helping slaves to escape. Harriet Tubman was the most famous conductor of the Underground Railroad. She went on 13 separate expeditions, rescuing around 70 slaves, 3 of which were her brothers. She was an escaped slave herself. Her methods were very cunning, very smart lady. She only worked in the winter, when the nights were long and people tended to stay indoors because it was cold. And she would always leave Saturday night with her. They would always make their escape on a Saturday night. Since there was no paper on Sunday, and so the paper wouldn't publish that there were any escaped slaves until Monday, and it gave the escapees a few days' start. Overall, it is estimated the Underground Railroad helped about 100,000 slaves escape from the South. Quickly, reaction to abolition. Despite the growing support for abolition. In the grand scheme of things, there weren't that many abolitionists even in the North. Some Northerners believed African Americans would not be able to blend in with American society. We call that assimilation. They didn't think they would be able to assimilate and become part of the culture. Others were fearful that banning slavery would start a war with the South. Where did they get that idea? There were riots and violence against abolitionists on occasion. For example, one time, police had to arrest William Lloyd Garrison, the guy who made the Liberator, in order to protect him from an angry mob. In the South, they had more or less thought slavery was an essential part of life, that every civilization had a class of people to do the hard labor for them. And for the South, it was the slaves. They claimed that the slaves had it better than factory laborers in the North because at least the slaves got food and shelter and medical care. And even though they get paid in the North, they got paid very little but had to supply their own food and housing and things like that. That was their argument. They also had the argument that African Americans they couldn't take care of themselves. They needed white people to look after them. So you can see that a lot of it was a lot of these beliefs were founded in just racism. Let's see. It pretty much ends the lesson. The conflict between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. It would continue to grow. Those tensions would continue to mount. In Lesson 3, we're going to talk about the women's movement, and then we're going to move into what is essentially the prequel chapter to the Civil War, where, of course, anti-slavery and pro-slavery forces finally explode into the Civil War. So that's it for the lesson. Next page is your quiz. 10 points, 5 questions, multiple choice. You have 2 attempts if you need them. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, have a wonderful day.